Thank you. Not used to hearing my own voice. So today, I hope everybody's here to learn more about Azure, Azure services. It's my fancy title. But the reason when I was asked to do a presentation about Azure that I chose not to do virtual machines is because everybody's heard that before, right? Everybody knows that Azure does virtual machines, but it does so much more than that. So I wanted to expose people to the other things that I think are probably useful, that people can take advantage of, that are beyond virtual machines. I wanted to do like a beyond Thunderdome kind of thing, but I don't think they were going to let me do that. So basically, how can you improve your systems? How can you improve your network, your infrastructure, not by not adding more virtual machines? And there's an asterisk there, and I'll explain that when we get there. I'm going to break that line. So information about me, like I said, I've been there for 21 years. I have 3 kids, 2 cats, and a tortoise.
Which one are you most proud of?
It depends on the day. I was going to say that the tortoise is the most well-behaved, but he escaped this summer, and we looked for like an hour and a half before we finally found him. So there's my family. We went on a vacation to Glacier National Park, which is awesome. But on a serious note, like, why would you listen to me? I've taken a lot of certification tests, which is a terrible reason to listen to anybody because that just means you memorize things. But I have been doing this for 21 years. It is something that I enjoy doing, and I like paying attention and staying on top of this types of things. So I've been paying attention to Azure for probably like the last 2 or 3 years now. So I think I kind of have a pulse of what's kind of going on. So before we get too much further about the actual presentation, this is what Gartner Group defines information as a service is, and I'm not going to read it because it's kind of boring, but just to be clear, information as a service is running virtual machines somewhere. We all have virtual machines in Hyper-V or VMware or somewhere else. This is being able to run it from a different provider. We all have private clouds in our networks right now running on VMware. This is a public cloud. So most of the services that I'm going to be referring to, this is the shared responsibility model. You've probably seen it before. It's a standard fare in all Microsoft presentations. But on-prem, you're responsible for everything. The operating system, the hardware, the cooling, the whole thing. And the reason information, or IaaS, became a big deal is because you can get rid of the responsibility for your physical hosts, your data center, heating, cooling, a lot of those types of things. As you go further left, platform as a service, software as assurance, as a service, you get rid of responsibility to do more things. So the things that I'm going to be bringing up are more to the left of information as a service because we will have a pretty good idea what that stuff is. So I'm going to talk about Azure File Shares and talk about Azure Automation, which is really neat, kind of an expansive area. And then here's the asterisk, Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop. Those are virtual machines. I am cheating, but it's more about the management layer. It kind of sits in front of it and how you get access to them, because you have to spin them up and run them yourselves to a point. It's the management plane and how to get it and how to serve your customer, or your customers well. And your internal users are basically your customers. So Azure Files is basically a file share in the cloud. It's a file sharing service that sits on top of Azure storage. So you've probably heard about blob storage. They also allow you to Azure Files, file shares. NFS, SMB, Windows, Linux, Mac OS clients can all attach to it. You can actually run a NetApp filer on top of Azure Files, Azure storage if you wanted to. So we all have file servers. So sometimes we have some customers that have a server, file server, domain controller, and Microsoft will tell you that to get rid of your file server, you just put it in SharePoint. Exactly. So SharePoint's not my favorite thing in the world, but it does what it does, and it does it pretty well. It's the back end for everything nowadays, OneDrive and all the rest of it. But Azure Files has definitely come along. It does a lot of really interesting things. So, when you think of anything platform as a service, software as a service, you get rid of the server to update and manage and configure and do those types of things because it is just literally a service. The data is encrypted at rest. You get to use protocols that you understand, SMB, NFS, Windows, Mac OS, and Linux support. You can back it up with Azure Backups. This is interesting. I'm going to break these lights. The private link is a service where it allows you to tie a Azure service to essentially a network interface and run it through Azure networking. So all of these services can run natively, fully exposed to the internet. So you can map a network drive in Windows and connect to your file share anywhere in the world. You don't need a VPN, you don't need any special connection. It's SMB3, it's HTTPS, it's all encrypted. But if from a regulatory standpoint, if you weren't allowed to do those types of things, or you just didn't want to do that, you can pin it to a private link interface, and then it will go through your VPN and then connect to the service. So in your network, you can control your traffic and where it goes. And there are some telcos or some ISPs that actually don't let you connect SMB things. When I was testing all this kind of stuff, I found that you'll be at home or your firewall, because that's a way to share files and things, and bad guys will use it to move data around, that it'll just be blocked, hard blocked, so you don't get to do anything with it. But you can get around that type of thing if you use something like a private link. Soft delete is essentially like a recycle bin. So if you have files out there and something bad happens to them, they get deleted, you can bring them back in a certain whatever context that you set up your retention period for. This last one, or second last one, is really interesting. It's really new, but it integrates with Active Directory domain services. So before, you could do your originally NTFS, or you could do your SMB shares, and if you had a mapping to the share, you had full permissions to it. You could do anything you wanted to it. So it didn't really work the way file shares normally do, or what we're expecting them to do. I'm an old guy, so I'm used to Active Directory and file services and all the rest of that. You'd have to do Azure Active Directory domain services, which is a Active Directory through as a platform as a service in Azure, not the same as regular Active Directory that we all have in our networks. Now, we can tie these file shares and set up NTFS permissions based on our local Active Directory domains. So if you have an accounting share and you have an accounting group in your existing Active Directory, you can apply those NTFS permissions to that group on a Azure file share. So it really does extend this into Azure without having the server there. And then it works with distributed file system. So if you're using distributed file system, it's basically a directory of directories, a directory of shares on your network. You can tie an Azure file share to your distributed file system, and you can move files up into Azure and nobody would know any different where they're at. So here's an example of just that. So this is a archive share that I added to a distributed file system, and pointer. And here's where the share goes. So this is actually using a private link endpoint. So it's going through a VPN tunnel up to Azure. So here's the share and how DFS is getting connected to it, and here's how it shows up to the end user. So nobody will know what it is. So if you in this case, archive, nobody ever deletes anything anymore because disk space is free, right? So they'll just keep things forever. So you can throw everything into an archive folder, and it isn't on your file server like it normally would be. So you can decide to back it up differently, or whatever you need to do with that. So Azure Automation, that definition actually kind of matters, but it's a group of different services that provides you a way to sift through your configuration, update services, and define configurations through DSC, and then run scripts. And it's a lot more than running scripts, but that's the easiest way my brain kind of works around it.
Mike, can I ask you a question about the previous slide?
Yes.
Look for a way to get free service out of you. I have a question. No, so when we're looking at the file shares, I'm looking for a way to secure the locations that I save data on with like an Azure file share. But when you think of cryptography and how it can travel across your network, do you think, file shares in this method to prevent, even though they're encrypted at rest, can you use it as a way I didn't want to go too deep in that rabbit hole, but I was just thinking about that.
Natively, I don't think a system that doesn't have access to this would be able to go out and find it and do anything with it. But if this directory's, so if you're using DFS to map a drive to it, and the ransomware, the crypto virus is able to see it, it's going to be able to touch it and do things to it. So that'd be the risk. Now, if your users are used to just browsing out and doing things and not mapping drives, that'd be a little bit different. So it's an interesting case.
The only way that you would have that issue is you set up your storage account to be public and anonymous, like the container. If you had that, then you'd be vulnerable. As long as you lock it down with key set.
So, okay.
Hey, Mike,
Hmm.
did you wanna talk about Azure Files Sync too?
No. I only have 45 minutes and I talk a lot.
I would love to know about Azure Files.
I know, and we'll talk about that later.
I'll get a bill for it.
So Azure Automation has a bunch of different things under the umbrella. So here, I took screenshots instead of doing a demo because I didn't know how big the screen is and how easy it can be seen. Because when you're using the Azure portal on a widescreen monitor, you can see all the stuff. Not knowing the resolution you get in these screens. So I took screenshots. And if somebody would rather see a demo, we can work that out. But this is a snapshot of the pane on the left-hand side. So we see there's inventory, change tracking, desired state configuration, DSC, update management, and process automation. So configuration management, collect inventory about machines and servers and software that's on it, track changes as things get modified or things get installed, and configure the state. So depending on your organization, there's a movement to making sure that your platform, your servers are all set up to be the same, right? So if you have a web server farm, if you're going to deploy a server, you can have a very customized image and deploy everything from that image, and then every time something changes, you have to fix your image. So DevOps, things like strategies like that, basically say deploy a dumb image, and then apply configuration to it, because then it's easier to configure the little individual pieces than it is to have one big monolithic image. So desired state configuration, and I'll have some slides on it, basically said, I'm deploying a server, I'm telling you it's a web server, deploy IaaS to it because I've deemed it to be so, and then do other configurations and things to it. So update management, Microsoft Update on your system, controlling it through Azure. Process automation, so that's Runbooks, basically using it to do automation. And it's easy to say automation, and I get lost in the trap of what do I want to automate? But it's kind of whatever you can think of, and we can talk about some examples on that. But works on Windows and Linux, Azure, and on-prem. And it's great because it has role-based access control. You can schedule everything with different scheduling mechanisms. You can connect it to a CI/CD pipeline. So if you're doing scripts or code in GitHub or wherever you're going to store it, you can connect that to your runbooks. So it's not just copy and paste as somebody like me would do. It's all audited. You can put tags on it. So change tracking and inventory. Basically, it's an agent on your system that's going to pay attention to what software is on it, what software has changed on it, if it's the state of a server has changed, anything like that. That sounds super boring, and it is, but from a security context, you have to have an idea of what you have. If you can't secure anything unless you know that it exists, that it's on a system, right? So it's easy for somebody to say, well, I don't have any Adobe Photoshop in my network, until you put agents on there and you do a search and you find out the marketing department has installed Photoshop everywhere. So now you weren't paying attention to doing patches on those systems. So, and then the change tracking is to figure out what's changed in the system. Has anybody done anything, or software showed up or removed, and so on. So here's an example of what that window looks like. And this is a live pull of information, which is why things have been blurred out, but there's 27 servers reporting back into this automation account in the last 24 hours, and it's detected 3 new pieces of software. So the agent itself will check in every 15 minutes or so, report back what's happening. Up top here, you can see 27 machines. 8,000 individual pieces of software that it's tracking. Files and registry are set up to be 0 because I didn't configure, you configure it to track files or registry settings. So by default, it's not going to just pay attention to all of Windows registry or all of your files. But if you had a INI file for a program and things would get changed on it, or you wanted to make sure that nothing changed, or registry keys that for a particular app that needed to be set a particular way, you could set those in there and it would monitor that. It would pay attention to if something had changed or they showed up or didn't show up. So Windows services, I don't have any Linux systems in this section, and machine groups, ways to do filtering on this. Names of your servers, the operating systems. You can see there's some Azure machines, non-Azure machines, and when they checked in. So drilling into this menu, trying to think of an example of what was there. And so I was curious if I had this particular piece of software installed. It's tree size free. It's something that shows you disk space used on a system, what's using it, what directories are full. But in the example of, well, nobody has this software on your system, or what versions do I have? You know, like, how would you find that out? In your existing environment, how would you find that out? If you didn't know, you'd sit on every machine and you'd look, which takes a ton of time. So this allows you to create queries. Here's what that query actually looks like. This is generated in a language called Kusto, KQL, very SQL-like, but there's a lot of templates available, customer-made queries, and Microsoft has a bunch of things that you can search through organically, but I modified it to be publisher starts with Jam software, and here's a list of all the systems that have it, the versions that I had. So if there was a particular security problem with one of the versions, or from a licensing perspective, I needed to make sure I had the right licenses for all these types of things. Without touching all the machines, I can look at all that information and pull a report, and now I have more information about what I was looking for.
Hey, Mike, is this available just on VDI and server OSs, or can you get any on-prem?
I think if it's Windows or Linux and you can get the agent on it, you can get anything.
And on the local workstation OSs too?
Mhm.
It runs through the log analytics.
All right.
Yeah, Microsoft Management Agent. So here's a more relevant example, perhaps. So Windows services. There was a vulnerability that you may or may not have caught called Print Nightmare. And it's bad. Printers are terrible. Security problem with printers is a pretty big deal. And the remediation was to stop the print spooler service on anything that wasn't acting as a print server. So the crown jewels are your domain controllers, right? So I knew that I went to my domain controllers and stopped the print server service. But if my security department asked me, did you do this? I say yes. They're not going to believe me because they're security people and they don't believe anybody. So I would be able to go into the Windows services, search for print, see the spooler service, and here's where some of this other information is good. So you can see the different colors there. It's running on 25 of the 27 servers, but it's stopped on 2 of them. I have 2 domain controllers. I'd stopped it on 2 of them. Well, that makes sense. And then I set the service to be disabled. So I know I can prove that I stopped the print server service on these 2 domain controllers, and I set it to disabled, which allows validation for what I did. So from a reporting standpoint, screenshot or whatever you need to do, here's how I remediated this. If you have a ticketing system, you copy paste in your ticketing system, and it's not just doing the fix, it's proving that you did it. So this would be a easy way to follow up on that. So there's obviously other examples, but this was top of mind at the time. Update management. There's a lot of different ways to do this. Windows Update Services, Microsoft Update, RMM agents, a lot of different things. But when you register these machines with Microsoft Management agents and they're reporting, you can also run your updates through here. It will trigger updates from Microsoft Update. So in this particular snapshot, I have 2 non-compliant machines. I can see critical and security updates, other, not assessed, a bunch of information, right? And depending on whatever day it is, this is obviously going to change because Windows updates come up monthly on Tuesday, so if this was the Monday before or the Wednesday after, these things are going to fluctuate. But if I drill in on the machines, I can get more information about which two are non-compliant. It's these servers, the names are blurred out. What critical updates, how many are missing, the update source, because you can tie this to a Windows Update Services server on site if you don't want them pulling everything online, and then that the update rate, the agent is reporting. So you can see the compliance to your update template basically, and a bunch of information. Azure machines, non-Azure machines, Linux could be in here. Linux would pull from their individual distro for updates. I'm not a huge Linux person, so I'll believe them on that. But, and if I look at the missing updates in general, like which ones are missing from the system, here's more information. I can see what's missing, if they're critical, what operating system they're for, how many machines are missing that particular update, because keeping tabs of what's updates or why they're not applying is big from a security standpoint. Now, one thing I did find out, and I did get confirmed because I opened a ticket with Microsoft, is this mechanism at this point does not push drivers. It lists them, and if you go to, it's super bizarre, if you've been doing this a while, that VMware, Microsoft is publishing VMware drivers at all is surprising, based on how that relationship started. But so right now, it does not do drivers. So a lot of the missing updates in this system, in the screenshots, are all drivers. So if I wanted to push drivers, I would have to run a script, or I'd have to touch them manually, or I'd have to do another mechanism. But this will not do drivers at this point, and I don't know. I'd asked, and they didn't have an update of what would change on all of that. So, and here's an example of all of this information is in a Log Analytics workspace. It's a big logging engine that Microsoft backends all of this with. But if I dig in on a particular server, and here's a KQL query, I didn't build this. I'm not this smart. I used whatever was in there. So, but I did change the computer name. And if you look at it, it's pretty natural language. So if I wanted to run this on a different computer, I would just change the computer name. Or I wanted to just do Linux systems. You can see how it's pretty easy to change from a scripting perspective. And here's the updates that are missing on this particular system. So just another way to report the information that I'm already capturing. Here are deployment schedules. In this example, I have two deployment schedules, one for my canary group of servers, semi-important servers that update the morning after Patch Tuesday, and then everything else on the following morning. Because hopefully catching, if there's a really, really bad one, it doesn't take the whole network down on a Friday morning, which would be terrible. So, but you can, in the deployment schedule, you can choose what group, or all of your systems, or all of your Azure systems, so you can customize it. It isn't just an all or nothing, you're shotgunning across everything in your environment. You choose your maintenance window, that it's 120 minutes. If it goes beyond your maintenance window, then it will just stop trying to apply the updates and catch it in the next cycle. Here's the history of all my jobs. You can, back to the maintenance window, you can see how long it took to do updates on any of these particular days. However many updates were there, the longer it's going to take. But if it did ever hit this end of the timer, it's going to stop. Here's the one that's failed. All the rest of them have been succeeding, so you can get reporting on how successful all this has been. And then looking on that particular failed job, failed 2 machines. So it cut off oddly here, but you've been able to see which update that it didn't do. So Azure Automation runbooks. This is the really, really neat portion of it that it takes. Well, everybody knows the all the things meme, right? So, but you want to automate anything. Anything that you don't like doing, or you have to do often, or you have a hard time doing repetitively, successfully, each and every time. The idea is to automate it, and like what mechanism to use to automate it. There's many different mechanisms. This is another one that's available. So when we dig into the Runbooks menu, whoop, I knew I was going to do that backwards. There we go. Here's the default. Here's the 3 runbooks that are there by default. Different types: PowerShell, Python, and a graphical runbook. You can edit one, and then when you're done editing, you publish it, and then it would run that version of it. Published, I mean that whatever version of this is there, it's ready to run. Here's another one in edit. So when you have a bit of version control, you can edit something, and if it runs, you have to make sure you publish it before it actually runs. So if you're pounding through and the code and it's not quite right yet, you know it's not going to fire a bad one until you actually go through and publish it. So the PowerShell runbook and the graphical runbook, these 2 items, this is the view of the the graphical runbook, and that's the PowerShell runbook. These do exactly the same thing. But depending on your comfort with working in code or copy and pasting blindly code off the internet, which we all do, right, without knowing what it does, this is more like an Azure Logic app or Azure Flow or any of the other graphical representations of that. So you can logically tie together how things are going to run and what order they're going to run and all the different tasks. This is doing the same thing. So whatever you're comfortable with, you can do graphical runbooks at first, and then as you get more advanced or you have different things that or code you trust, you can do PowerShell runbooks. But there are 2 different ways of doing exactly the same thing. Python, there's only code for Python. I'm only a PowerShell person at this point, so when you actually click on a runbook, start, it just runs the runbook. And whatever it's going to do, it's going to go off and do. View, you can see the code in a code editor in the browser. Edit, you actually see the code in the browser, and you can make changes to it, and then save it or publish it, and then you can go through and run it. Here I can tell it's in edit, it's a PowerShell runbook. But the neat other parts is you can link it to a schedule. So one of the great benefits of Azure is the ability to turn things off and not pay for it, like running virtual machines. So, or grow or shrink like a server farm or anything like, well, anything you can think of really. But this would allow you to schedule a job to run and to do whatever task and do it automatically. And then add a webhook is the ability to craft a specially configured URL to run the runbook. So you don't have to give anybody access to come in here and push the button. You can give them a URL to do essentially the same thing. So that, trying to think of examples, if you had a very finicky app on one of your servers and the only thing that fixed it was a reboot, but you didn't want to give whoever runs the system at 6 in the morning access to log in and do it, you could give them a URL that says if you have problems, double click on that, reboot the server, comes back, and that's an example of a useful way that I can think of to do that. And the other thing is these runbooks will connect. It's not just Azure. There's a hybrid worker too. So you can configure a server to essentially be your gateway into your network to run PowerShell scripts on your network. I made one at work that connects to our local Active Directory that creates a user, creates a local mailbox, ties it, syncs Azure Active Directory, grants them a license, connects the remote mailbox in a hybrid, and adds them to groups. Yeah, it depends on the payload, right? But I can run all that through a PowerShell or through a Runbook at this point. So, demo time. So this is where things won't work. But somebody click on this. You. So here's an example. This is a QR code that's tied to a webhook. And if that works, and he fires it up, it may take us a couple of seconds because Azure functions cold start and then warm start. We'll see if it works. And you're not deleting my boss's mailbox. Maybe, I don't know. You could. I mean, that's also some of the danger of some of this kind of stuff. So that's why logging and auditing and role-based access control is important, and tying it to a GitHub repo and paying attention to your code and stuff matters at the end of the day. Oh. So he turned on the light over there, and he's changing the color on it, and he's going to do it for the rest of the presentation because he has severe ADHD. But when you think about it, we're just turning a light on, and nowadays that isn't very very interesting because all these smart light bulbs have their own apps to do the thing. But it's a good representation of anything you can think of in your environment that you could figure out how to code just by sharing a URL. We can run that. So I thought it was, I've seen that example online, and I've always wanted to do it in a presentation, and it worked. Awesome. So desired state configuration, as I mentioned, is the idea of treating servers as cattle, not pets. DevOps is, because we've all had servers that are very customized, and you have to reboot them in certain ways, and if services start, you have to do certain things to them. DevOps wants to get away from that type of situation where you deploy a rather vanilla image and you define layer configurations on it, like web services is the easiest example in a web server farm, and then it customizes itself basically. So here's that's the QR code if you want to keep flipping it instead of just him. But so here's what it looks like. It's PowerShell. So you define your DSC state. You know, if this feature, if this is on a node where this needs to run, it will install web server, which it's install feature web server installs IaaS on a system. Or if it's set to node, if on the node is not web server, it will take it off. So from a security perspective, if by default, Microsoft's getting better, but it's very easy to over-install services and have extra stuff on your servers that you don't need to have on there. So this would be a way to define servers, and that's not a web server. It should not have web servers on it, and it will uninstall it from there. So here's a screenshot from the documentation. There's one node in there. It's configured to be not a web server, which means if IaaS is installed, after the agent checks in, depending how you have the thing configured, it's going to remove IaaS from the system. Here's kind of what that looks like. You're deploying or configuring the node configuration, refresh frequency. These two numbers will check in, how often it checks in with the service to look for new configuration, changes to the configuration, because it's not just the PowerShell. You write the PowerShell, and you configure it, or you deploy it, and then it turns into code. And then that's the code that's run on it, so it's not just PowerShell. And then it will check every 15 minutes to see if IaaS is installed, and then do whatever you tell it to do. In this case, apply and monitor. So not a web server. It'd be easier if this was web server, because then it would apply it, make it a web server, install IaaS, and then monitor the changes and report back in the portal if it's compliant. So then you'd find out if that service is on there or not. If it was apply and remediate, I don't remember what it is right now, but if it deployed it and then it finds that somebody removed it and it got that other state, it will actually put it back on. So somebody could go, I don't need that on there, and accidentally uninstall it, and then it's going to get installed back on there in 15 minutes. So you kind of see how you're defining a state for a system, and this configuring it, and the system just knows to check in and go, I need to be this, here's what I need to be, instead of defining it all and letting it out there and configuration drift and all those types of problems. So here's the asterisk portion, the virtual desktops. I mean, I understand that they are virtual machines, but like I said, it's about the control plane, and since Windows 365 just came out, I figured it'd be a good idea to kind of talk about it a little bit, because it's going to come up in conversation. But you know, why do you do virtual desktops? Everybody knew work from home. You know, as soon as you send 75 people home, how do they do work? Like if you don't already have a remote desktop system or VDI or something, how do you get people from outside of your network connected to your network to do work? Virtual desktop is one of many ways to go through that. So 365, I don't believe this at all. It's the world's first cloud PC, but it's good marketing. It's a way to consume a Windows 10 image and soon to be a Windows 11 image. Here's what the portal looks like. This person has 3 different desktops deployed to them. So you can either connect through an RDP client or you can open your Windows 10 in a browser. So it's very accessible to non-technical people. There's a business and an enterprise version. Business is up to 300 seats, enterprise is beyond that. There are some very quirky differences between the two that you'll find. The business is essentially a Windows 10 computer that you have access to. So if you just needed to run SaaS apps from somewhere and you hired 50 new people, but you couldn't get new desktops deployed and you don't want to do remote access, you could do this. Enterprise allows you to have these same Windows desktops and do more like connect back to your enterprise network, have a VPN connection back to Azure resources or something else, and then obviously scale beyond 300 users. So Azure Virtual Desktops, used to be Windows Virtual Desktop, is the same but different. Really, at the end of the day, your users are connecting to a desktop. They don't care how they connect, they just want to connect to it. Azure Virtual Desktop is a lot more customizable. So it uses multi-user, or can use multi-user Windows 10 images. So instead of one Windows instance and one user, you can have a Windows 10 instance and have 6 users on it. So from a resource perspective, it's a lot more efficient, just like remote desktop, except for using Windows 10 images. But it has the ability to scale out and scale in. There's a web client to connect to it. You can publish applications if you didn't want to do the whole desktop itself. If you just wanted to do an ERP app that was web-based or something else, you could just do those types of things. So it is much more customizable. There is more to it at the end of the day, but at the same time, there's more customization to it. You can control more of what's going on. And you can do things like, you get to assign your virtual machines, so you can apply GPUs to it. So if you're an engineering company or you're doing some medical imaging or you needed GPUs, you can do that. The cloud PCs is not for that. So the next couple of slides are from a company called Nerdio. They do Azure management, and they did a pretty good breakdown of all the differences. But when you do the Azure Virtual Desktop, like the overarching thing is you're in control of pretty much everything that's going on, right? The business, it's fully Microsoft managed. It's fixed cost compared to the Windows 365. You're paying per user per desktop. Fixed cost has nothing to do with resources. You have no benefit for turning it off and on. $28 a month is $28 a month, depending on the size of your virtual machine. On the Azure Virtual Desktop, you can, if you don't have anybody running in the evening, you can configure it to turn them all off in the evening and save that compute costs. So, local profiles in the Windows 365 compared to being able to run FS Logic's profile management. So, like the business is really like setting a Windows 10 computer in front of somebody. There's no roaming profiles, so if you sign into 365 and you get your OneDrive sync, that's about all you're going to get. This, as you saw in the previous portal, there really isn't anything to assign for the 365 portion. I did it recently. I actually have it configured on my laptop. If you want to catch me later, we can log into one and see what it looks like. But there really isn't any portal to manage. So you get your license, you assign it to a group in Azure Active Directory, and that person signs in, goes to the web page, and they have a license, and they can get to their desktop. All of the Azure Virtual Desktop is all through the Azure portal. There's a particular blade, and they've gone as fast as they could, really. It's like just-in-time engineering. So the Azure Virtual Desktop portal was a really pretty primitive at first, and they've come out with this spring release and added a whole bunch of more features to it. So they're working as fast as possible to make it as customizable as like a VMware View or anything else and the other products out in the market. So, you know, there's no hyper-level backups of your cloud 365 desktops. So you can kind of see in your mind, frame out where you might use these particular things. And the licensing, of course, everybody loves licensing, but there's a 365 Cloud PC license, Azure Virtual Desktop is Azure Consumption. Networking, if you're gonna do the Windows 365 Enterprise and you get connected back to your network, you get billed through Azure for your networking. There's none for the business. Intune is required for the 365 Enterprise. And Office, because it is an individual PC, it isn't a shared resource, you can use any Office subscription. So if you're still buying box copies of, I age myself, nobody buys software in boxes, Mike. But if you have any Office subscription, retail or any of the rest of it, that's what would be there. But for Windows Virtual Desktop, especially if it's a pooled one, you have to have shared computer access rights. And there's particular versions of Office that support that. Which one's right? After going through and reading a bunch of things, I think 365, especially business, is great for less than 10 users. If they're all using SaaS applications, because you really can't reach back into your own environment to talk to your own file shares, things like that. If they require local admin rights, which is a terrible security practice, but everybody does it. And you want if you need 24/7 availability, and because it's a flat cost, you don't get any benefit from turning it off and on. For Azure Virtual Desktop, especially if you're doing graphical resource intensive applications like CAD or any medical imaging or something, because you can apply GPU-based virtual machines and assign them through Azure Virtual Desktop. If you want to do app streaming, or you want to scale it up and down, depending on time of year, 50 users versus 100 users, easily scale up and down. With the Cloud PC, you'd be adding 50 licenses for that month and then taking the 50 licenses. It doesn't matter how much they use. Strangely, I made it. Every time I've done this, I've been like 50 minutes, so I'm doing pretty good. So there's a ton of other things that are not virtual machines that are really, really cool that I think everybody should take a look at if you're interested in. So Azure Log Analytics is the logging engine that's behind Azure Automation. That's the thing that collects all of the Windows Update information, all the change configuration information, similar to Splunk and Elasticsearch. Azure Arc, it's a hybrid management piece that allows you to see your on-prem computers in your Azure portal, install the MMA agent, and run your updates to that. Azure Sentinel is a SIM and a SOAR. It's a security piece, gets the information and looks for security events. Purview is very new. It's super big brothery, but you configure your data sources and you tell it that I don't want PII to ever be in this directory, or it tells you that PII is in your Windows file share or in this database, and it's up to you to classify it and determine what should be where. But when you have a file share, you never know if somebody accidentally copied all of your customers' social security numbers and credit card numbers in a spreadsheet in the wrong folder. And this type of service is made for data governance. Azure SQL Databases, Platform as a Service, Azure, and Azure Site Recovery is replicating your servers with low RPOs, disaster recovery and or migration. So if you take your virtual machines, copy them as is up into Azure, do a failover, and then you're in Azure. So, does anybody have a question? There's my contact information. This is actually the code that makes that little lamp change colors. I don't see any questions online, so there's that thing if you want to change the color a bunch. I do it all day at the office. People are wondering what's wrong with me. I'm like, but it works. They don't know why. I'm like, but it works. So, questions? Just anything? I know you have questions.
On that Azure Purview, is that available for a traditional on-prem Windows file share, or is it only for Azure Files?
If it doesn't stretch to traditional files, it will soon. Have you caught any of that stuff? It went out of public preview. It's full GA right now, so it's really new.
Yeah.
But I could look for you.
It does work in Azure Files?
I think it will check your blobs and stuff.
Fantastic.
If nothing else, you know that I have to do it soon, because
Yeah.
that's the,
It's likely not gonna be based on some kind of, crawler that goes through an SMB share, it has to be Windows, API type.
probably through the Microsoft Management Agent too, probably is how it looks at the information.
Mostly fantastic.
If there's no other questions, thanks for attending. I'll be around. I have the cloud PC stuff. Ask me some questions later.